two groups of speakers who are going to share how they are being disruptive in this space here locally and regionally across the South. Quite innovative work happening. And I did want to start by setting the stage just a little bit. So I also am co-facilitating this session with Gabrielle Newell, who is with OPRE, the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, who will serve as a discuss and offer reflection points afterwards. And so you'll see her in just a moment once we wrap these presentations. I'll start with just giving some local context, just as an example, as I envision Atlanta as somewhat of a microcosm of what the rest of the nation is experiencing. So, some of you may be familiar with the statistic, but in Atlanta, if you are born in poverty, you only have about a 4% chance to make it into the highest income quintile in this city. Moreover, roughly more than 1 in 3 Black households are liquid asset poor. They don't have the resources to sustain themselves and their families for more than 3 months in the event of some type of economic disruption, such as a loss of income, loss of wages, and more. And Atlanta is the #1 place in the country for income inequality and has held that distinction for over 30 years, in addition to being the 5th place for the Black-white wealth gap. In fact, the white wealth net worth is 46 times greater than it is for Black households in the city of Atlanta. So that's just a little local context to kind of set the stage in terms of what is happening, not just in the city, but also around the region. In spite of, monumental economic gains pre-COVID, and even as we're coming out of the pandemic-driven recession, there's still lots of work to do. A lot of families have been left behind, and I'm so excited to listen and learn from these organizations that are coming together to help address longstanding issues that are also mediated by systemic racism, sexism, and more. So first, to kick it off, if I could have our friends from In Her Hands at the Grow Fund come on stage. This is a team represented by Renee Peterkin, who's the Deputy Director of the Grow Fund, otherwise known as the Georgia Resilience and Opportunity Fund. Erin Quick, who is a social work student at Clark Atlanta University. Simone Smith, also a student at Clark, and Disha Elliott, also a student at Clark. So I'm going to pass it over to In Her Hands, which is the name of the initiative that Grow Fund facilitates. And I'll serve as a slide, a clicker, basically. So just tell me when you're ready to advance and we'll get it going. So I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
Awesome, sounds good. Can everyone hear me? Awesome, thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to present this to you. So we're going to be discussing the In Her Hands Guaranteed Income Initiative. Next slide, please. So what is In Her Hands? In Her Hands is a guaranteed income initiative that started here in Georgia. We service 3 communities. Our participants are primarily Black women at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. And we'll get into a little bit more of the details as we progress through the presentation. Next slide, please. I am now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. This is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, which was published in 1967. That was over 50 years ago. Dr. King came to this point due to the work of a Black woman activist by the name of Johnny Tillman, who was doing welfare rights activism at the time. And so I'd like to start with this just to demonstrate that the idea of a guaranteed income supports have been around for over 70 years at this point, but this is even on Dr. King's radar 50 years ago. Next slide, please. So what is a guaranteed income At its most basic level, a guaranteed income offers an income floor. It's regular unconditional cash payments to individuals or households, regardless of their working status, their family status. And it's designed to ensure that there is an income floor, a minimum level to support folks. Next slide, please. So in 2022, the Grow Fund, the Georgia Resilience and Opportunity Fund, along with our implementation partner, Give Directly, launched the In Her Hands Guaranteed Income Program. This was started by a community task force at the height of COVID in 2020. Folks in the community were interested to know what was driving economic insecurity in the community. On one block, you have some of the largest tract of Section 8 housing in America, one block over from $1 million homes. And so seeing what can be done to kind of put the brakes on that, because it was kind of going at a breakneck speed. And so just curious to know, how can we address this? So the task force, their ultimate recommendation was a guaranteed income program to strengthen at-risk families in the Old Fourth Ward, which also happens to be Dr. King's birth neighborhood, and where he preached at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and where he and Coretta are buried today. And so with this key recommendation, the In Her Hands program was launched. And we found that throughout our research in this task force and conducting surveys and other forms of research, that Georgia has some of the highest rates of racialized poverty and inequality in the United States, and has one of the least generous social safety nets. Black women in Georgia face more economic insecurity than nearly any other demographic, and they are 2 times as likely to be stuck in poverty as white women. Black women have the highest labor force participation rate, yet have the highest income disparities and lowest levels of wealth of any group. And we chose 3 sites with high rates of high disparities and condensed Black community experiencing poverty in the Atlanta's Old Fourth Ward, in rural Southwest Georgia, and in College Park. So that gives us an urban, a rural, and a suburban site. Next slide, please. So why the focus on Black women? Why not Black women? Considering that we're combating narratives of deservedness, why not start with Black women? Despite being resilient and resourceful, things just are not adding up. And so wanting to invert the traditional power structure of those most impacted, their voices should be elevated in finding solutions. Focusing on those experiencing the harshest impact of the system helps to create policy and program changes. Lifting from the bottom, everyone rises. And focusing on Black women is central to uprooting the anti-Black narratives that drive public policy. Next, please. So what is In Her Hands? In Her Hands provides an average income floor of $850 for 654 women in 3 communities across the state, 1 urban, 1 rural, 1 suburban. And we have 2 program goals: to support Black women experiencing financial insecurity in Georgia, and to achieve greater financial stability and overcome wealth decelerators, and to generate and disseminate insights to promote more racially inclusive, just, and sustainable social safety net models and policies in the U.S. Next slide, please. In support of generating these insights, we wanted to know the impact of payment amounts for program participants. So I mentioned an average of $850. Because community members were a part of the design of this program, they indicated that in order for this program to make sense to them, they would need a minimum of $850. This is in order to combat any potential loss to public benefits that they might be receiving. But upon further discussion, folks really said, if I just had a lump sum, a boost at the beginning, they will be able to make investments in mid-size things like a car, moving costs, education fees, paying down some debt that would allow them to get a solid foot forward. And so that's what you see here, the average of $850 a month over 2 years. But at the end of the 24 months, both cohorts are going to be, or will have received $20,400. Next slide, please. Another component to generating insights was the 3 locations. So our urban location is in Atlanta's Old Fourth Ward, with 20% of residents living under the federal poverty limit and 38% of Black women living under the federal poverty limit. Our rural counties in Southwest Georgia, Terrell, Randolph, and Clay counties. Not only just due to the stark need, but typically when programs like this are enacted, they're in major cities, Chicago, LA, New York, and the rural communities are really left out. And it's also where Black people kind of historically are rooted in America. So just not wanting to leave them behind and making sure we are doing our due diligence in trying to represent everybody. And then College Park, with the suburbanization of poverty, wanting to make sure that we kind of hit 3 areas that made sense. Next slide, please. And so our program goals are, again, to support Black women by experiencing financial insecurity in Georgia and generate insights to promote more racially equitable and just policies and economic frameworks. Next slide. The dignity of the individual will flourish when the decisions concerning his life are in her own hands. This is a quote by Dr. King. It's what helped name our program In Her Hands, because we believe that the folks closest to the issue know the solutions to the issue. It's just a matter of having the tools to get there. And so supporting them with that. In this case, the tool is money. You know, it might be nice for folks to have SNAP benefits, housing benefits, which are really helpful, but that tool is only useful for that specific thing. What if you need to put additional, gas in your car, your child needs shoes? So just the flexibility to offer people agency and choice and putting the decision in her own hands. So I'm going to pass it over to.
When we looked at the research design, this is a community-based participatory research design. And so meaning that there was an annual community advisory council. They gathered together for a few meetings, and collaboratively, they were able to come together with research questions. And those research questions centered around health, income, assets, how their family relationships were, employment. And then there were surveys that were given biannually that would note any quantitative data. And so we were able to do this in partnership with the Social Policy Institute at the Washington University in St. Louis. But then there were also biannual qualitative interviews. And so we randomized a subset of 90 participants, and we phenomenologically did qualitative analysis within those interviews. Next slide. So when we look at the demographics within those 3 neighborhoods, again, urban, suburban, rural, we're going to notice that on average, the participants were at least 37 years old. Anywhere between 92.7% to 97.1% were not living with a partner. When we look at those who did not have any children in the home, that ranged between 26.9% to 30.4%. And then for those who had 1 to 2 children in the home, ranged anywhere between 45% to 55.5%. And the remainder had 3 or more children. Next slide. So when we look at the baseline, we had surveyed the participants to understand whether there was no or extremely limited access to certain community services. And so those range from banks, whether they had access to internet, grocery stores, hospitals, childcare, employment, public transportation. And so, within these different community resources, we definitely see anywhere between 20.8 to 41.3% did not have, or excuse me, on average, had extremely or somewhat difficult access to any of the community resources that I just named. Next slide.
All right, so continuing on with the baseline of our research, we also wanted to get an idea of their self-rated health, and so where they kind of determined where their health was physically, and then also access to health insurance. And so we saw that a significant portion, ranging between good to poor, of our participants said that that's where their health was in all of the 3 communities that they were in. Of course, we did have some who said it was excellent or very good, but a major portion, more than half, said that it was either good, fair, or just poor altogether. And then, of course, access to health insurance, just overall, about 69% said they had access to health insurance. And of course, we know that depending on what type of health insurance it is, will then determine what kind of care that they will get. We didn't necessarily go deep into that. However, about 70% had access to health insurance. All right, next slide, please. All right, then we wanted to get an idea of their assets and then also of their debt, where they were in regards to that. And so again, focusing just overall in regards to savings, credit card debt, education debt, loan debt, unpaid medical debt, and then personal loans. When it came to savings, in every community, everyone made it known that they had no savings. Kind of living paycheck to paycheck is kind of what we were seeing. Credit card debt, an overall of 747, education debt 16,000, auto loan debt 14,000. In regards to unpaid medical bills, 2,250, and then personal loans about 2,500. All right, next one. All right, and then baseline for, this is me, I'm sorry. Baseline for goals over the next 2 years. And so our program is lasting about 2 years, but what we're seeing right now is just kind of that initial, what it is that our participants, what they hope to achieve and what they want to just be successful in over these 2 years. And the major kind of goals that we saw were, getting caught up on bills and paying bills. And then I think the second most thing that we saw was just building emergency savings. And then we also saw reducing debt, building and improving homes. That's also significant. A lot of participants just want to improve where it is that they're living, not only for them, but also, of course, for their children. Improving credit score, which, of course, is related to being able to, purchase a car, purchase a home, and then starting and growing small business. We saw a lot of individuals just with wanting to be kind of entrepreneurs and they want to start their own businesses and kind of create their own business. And so that's also a major goal that we're seeing over the 2 years. Next slide.
All right. Now, as Deja mentioned in our research design slide, we also sent out surveys. So in 6 months, we did find some significant changes when it came to food insecurity. And as you can see, there has been some significant decreases from the baseline survey that we did and then the 6-month survey that we did after they've already been in the program for 6 months. So we can see in the beginning, we had more people who were hungry but didn't eat. They had to eat less than they needed. They skipped or cut the size or portion of their meals. They could not afford balanced meals, and food did not last in their home. But as we can see, 6 months later, the rates have gone down. Next slide. And also when it comes to hardships, we see something similar here, where there was difficulty affording bills. They could not see doctors. Phone service had been disconnected. They were not able to pay the full amount of utilities or did not pay the full amount of their rent or mortgages. So in every section, we see that there has been a decline from the initial survey results and our 6-month findings. Next slide. So then we'll also get into our qualitative themes that came out of our interviews with the participants. And here's some direct quotes from them. All right, so some themes that came up for us was business development and progress towards goals. So in business development, we see one person stated, I still have that same goal of starting a business. It's just now I can actually execute my plan because now I have a car and a home. Progress towards goals, one participant stated, I'm moving toward the goal, maybe about 80% now. Financially keeping my bills caught up and being able to take care of my needs, the needs of my grandchildren as well. Next slide.
Some more themes that we were able to code out within our interviews is financial capability and improve mental and physical health. And so one of the quotes for financial capability mentions, I know that I get these funds at a certain time of the month, but I'm not behind on anything, so I can put a portion to savings. I have more flexibility. And then for the improved mental and physical health, one participant noted, I think having this money has helped me utilize a healthier kind of eating plan and being able to buy those things that are high in protein and stuff and have that on a consistent basis to where I'm not always having fast food. So I think mentally eating healthy is doing something for me. Next slide.
All right. And then we also wanted to look at, and we also saw themes of impacts on relationship and improving of homes. I think just overall, what we were seeing is that I've been able to have more fun with my kids. I think that's a big thing because the financial stress is no longer there. My relationships are improving, whether it be with my immediate family, with my kids. In just 6 months, those were some of the improvements that we were seeing. Improvement in homes, being able to buy furniture, being able to just better the condition of my home. It's not there, but one participant was saying, my kid has asthma, but there's mold in my apartment. But now I've been able to fix that, and so now even just the breathing condition for my child is better. And so we've just already in 6 months alone, we're seeing those small improvements. Next slide.
All right. And also another theme that came up when we asked the question, what do you think would happen if everyone in your community or neighborhood were to receive a guaranteed income? And we got some pretty mixed responses on this one. I'll read a couple. I feel like it would have definitely helped the community a lot more if everybody could get the same thing. Then a lot of people would be able to help their lifestyle and stuff like that. Get jobs, get better cars, get transportation, and get better living. Someone else stated the environment wouldn't be so hostile. It wouldn't be a lot of crime going on if people had more help. Then someone else stated, well, as a perspective, I would have to rate it maybe 50-50. I think maybe 50% of people under the guaranteed income would benefit from the money and take care of themselves financially, setting their priorities right. But there may be that other 50%, I see that some of them may not be. They're misusing the money and they're not using it like they're supposed to. And so I would still give it 50-50, but I think it would still help some people. Next slide.
When we asked participants about their program feedback, they mentioned that it feels like they're doing a fantastic job. They're the first, I feel like they're the first of their kind because I've never been in a program where they directly actually give the people money for us actually spending on what we need. Actual money that I can use to pay my bills is amazing. And as we ask the participants, how would they feel about, when the program ends, or, a few of them kind of asked about what's next after the program is over. And so one participant mentioned, and so what I'm trying to do is prepare because I understand that the program is 24 months. So I'm trying to pace myself and get more going. So when the program ends, I will still be in a position where I could keep going and keep less stress off of me. Next slide.
All right, we're gonna hold off just a little bit for questions, but just in closing, just to reiterate, just in these 6 months, what we've been able to see is just that not only are participants already starting to improve their well-being and overall life, but then they're also thinking ahead of what comes next. And so we're really excited just over this 2 years to really see what our outcomes will be, but it's already just looking really good at this point. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, wonderful. Give them a round of applause. Yes. And let me say, yes, logistics wise, so we're going to hold questions until after our presentation. So please bring really great questions. I have many, but I'm just kind of like very like lit up over here because I actually got to participate in the task force that led to the creation of the initiative. So to see its progress is significantly, I don't know, it makes me happy. So congratulations and thank you for what you're doing. Next up, I would like to introduce or bring up Sterling Johnson. Sterling serves as the Director of the Just Opportunity Portfolio at the Partnership for Southern Equity. Yes. Awkward silences. Yes, let's close the awkward silences with applause. I love it.
Thank you, everyone.
I will pass it over to you, Sterling.
Awesome. I'll be really brief because I know there are probably a lot of questions and discussion we want to get to today. First and foremost, thank you all for being here today. My name is Sterling Johnson again with the Partnership for Southern Equity. If you go to the next slide for me, please. Our mission organizationally, we're here a racial justice nonprofit anchor here out of Atlanta. And our focus is on how do we improve and increase the access to policies and institutional actions that help to advance racial equity and shared prosperity, right? And so this isn't not just for the city of Atlanta and not just for our local neighborhoods, but we also think about this regionally as our approach. And so thinking statewide and across the Southeast as well. And so we operate in a number of different spaces. Next slide for me, please. We do that work and our work intersectionally. We have a number of different portfolios. I lead, of course, the Just Opportunity portfolio, which is focused on economic inclusion, which is why I'm here today. But also we have three other core portfolios. Our growth portfolio, which is more or less our sister portfolio in this work. We're looking at how do we use land use and infrastructure development, and how does that not only promote racial equity, because of course we know about the history of land use as a tool for racial disenfranchisement, but then how does that connect to economic opportunity? Our energy portfolio, which looks at climate justice and energy equity, and our health portfolio, which talks about racism as a form of social determinant of health, right? They're not just thinking about that there are negative health outcomes for people of color, but that is intentionally designed. And so how do we make sure that we will all work together to start to dismantle these systems of oppression for Black and brown people in communities of low wealth? In addition to that, we have our organizing component and our impact unit as well, which is our data team, which is focused on the way that we use and democratize access to data as well. Next slide for me. And so we start this conversation really in thinking about, and of course we all have this conversation constantly about systems change, but we really take kind of an inverted approach to this idea about systems change. That it's not just about how do we impose ourselves on these systems and structures, but how do we start to really change people, right, at the core of these systems, right? These systems are informed by values, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, but functionally, right, that there are people who believe certain things, whether they be true, right, facts and myths exist in the way that we use data and the way that impacts our public policy, but that there are people who believe things that then they take and extrapolate against the community as a whole or through policy and other that are then reinforcing the values that they have. And so for us, systems change is as much about connecting with and changing the individual as it is about changing these institutions that individuals have built and constructed as well. And so next slide for me, please, Alex. And so when we talk about our process, right, and I'm only grounding this because it's going to lead into a little bit of our research design later on, is that we believe, one, explicitly in working with and for communities of color. We lead with the idea of race in everything that we do. We understand that this isn't a conversation we can have without addressing that directly. And it's one thing that we're very uncomfortable in our country about talking about. And so this is something that we try to make sure we introduce with and start to deconstruct on the front end. We talk about catalyzing relationship, right? You know, working both at the grassroots and grass tops in community and through community voice, growing our equity ecosystem through partners like several who are here at this conference today, that we're always open and active to look at opportunities to partner with and through, and then grounding this approach in communities of color and communities of low wealth, right? It was referenced earlier that we believe that people closest to problems are also closest to solutions, right? And so how do we make sure that that lived experience and that wisdom shines through not only in the way that we think about programming and what we want to do, but how it's informing the approach that we take as advocates and as intermediaries on their behalf as well. And then how do we leverage all of the data, right, and engage in active research and community design research, right, and informed research as being a part of this process as well. And so our process of engagement kind of has these three prongs of approach, right? Really thinking about how do we engage marginalized residents and those who are directly impacted by inequitable policy to engage in decision-making about policy and policy intervention at the beginning, middle, and end of a process, right? It's a difference between community informed, right, and community engaged, right? Is that we might come to you and we think about a lot of times that we conflate these two things, but ultimately when we talk about community engagement, it's about how do we invite you into this process versus what we believe is engagement, which is often we've got this thing, we're going to bring it to you and then let you see what you like about it or not like. And at that point, it's often too late for them to even have any voice around what is being designed that's supposed to be often on their behalf, right? And so how do we start to change this paradigm on the front end? How do we create engagement opportunities that shape how public policy and practice is influenced by the wisdom of people who are in community, right? And so how do we make sure, again, that lived experience shines through? And then how do we cultivate spaces for new leaders, right? Whether that be new civic infrastructure, setting new tables, right? Amplifying community voices certain specific ways. So this is generally the way that we go about doing our work on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. So within the Just Opportunity portfolio, we think about this from these kind of three-pronged approach. How do we position communities of color, communities of low wealth to inform, participate, and benefit from the state, county, and municipal approach to economic development? And I'll talk a little bit about economic inclusion and what that is separately from this idea. The private sector's approach to economic growth and our community's approach and how we define economic sustainability, right? That we have oftentimes, and I was talking to someone earlier today, actually, about the distinction between being an economic developer and a Black capitalist, right? That those are two different things. This idea that we are not in service to our economy and that we know historically there have been things that have been done against communities of low wealth and communities of color, specifically in the idea of service to and growing our economy at all costs, right? And we understand that there are needs that have to be addressed and have to be closed, and how we talk about things like the racial wealth gap and disparities in our economic opportunity, et cetera. But we are not generally trying to do that for the sake of just making more people who can be in service to our economy as a whole. And so how do we start to be really intentional about how we frame that conversation up front? Again, our private sector's approach to economic growth, and how do we think about this idea about generative economy, right? That our economy should be circular. It should be regenerative to the sense that we're not only pulling from community or extractive in the way that we deal with people, but that is something that reinforces over time and helps to strengthen itself over time as well and repair, right? Being core and critical to that conversation also. Next slide for me, please. And so within our portfolio, we've got kind of four general interventions. One is our workforce justice initiatives. Two is democratizing capital, which we think about how do we disrupt this idea around the top-down flow of capital and how it traditionally operates. How do we really start centering community need and community voice, particularly again in low wealth and communities of color. Thinking about how we democratize development, right? And we're going to talk a little bit specifically about that in one of our community research interventions shortly. But this idea that development happens to people and not along with them, right? Particularly as we talk about communities in low wealth, where it becomes a buy low, sell high proposition economically, right? That it just makes good money sense, so people do it, not being thoughtful about the impact that that has on the people who occupy those spaces on the other side. And so how can we really start to reshape, again, the values that drive that opportunity, that focus? And then on the other side of that, our movement building and research work, right? We also are engaged in, at the core of every one of our portfolios, is coalition building. And then, of course, as an arm of that is research, right? How do we start to shape the ideas of what could be our new economy and our new world, right? How do we ground that with those new values that we all collectively design together? Next slide for me, please. So I'm sure you all have seen or heard, and reinforced over the course of this conference, all these different statistics, right? We already know and are familiar either with Atlanta specifically or the state of Georgia or the South, that we've got some very specific racial and economic disparities that we're trying to address, right? We know that in Atlanta right now, 80% of Black children are living in high poverty areas. right? Again, a function of segregation and racially restrictive covenants through our zoning and planning and design process. We know that Atlanta is among the worst in the country in economic mobility, right? Or immobility, right? This idea that if you're born into poverty, the odds are that you are not going to escape poverty in your lifetime, right? And then how do we start thinking about the way in which we start to really design interventions around this? I would encourage everyone, if you're not familiar with Opportunity Insights and their work, to look at some of the data that has been developed and designed, not only around this understanding about economic mobility, but social mobility and how they really contribute to one another, right? That there's an idea that you have to build social capital along with economic capital. And a lot of that has to be dispelled through the racial segregated and spatial design of our city as well. And so how do we get to the core of that? And I really say all that to lead into this idea around what is democratizing development and what does that look like? If you can go to the next slide for me, please, Alex. When we look at the history of development and design, if you see to the left is the Homeowners Loan Corporation's Neighborhood Redlining Guide. This is something that's a historic document. There have been several different copies and iterations of this. And for those who are unfamiliar with the zoning process, that zoning functionally determines how you can develop in community, what can be built where. You know, we talk about the way in which we understand redlining occurred in the generations before us, but then also as a function of redlining, there was also things like NIMBYs, right? Not in my backyard developments that were built up and designed and placed and used as buffers between Black communities and white communities, right? That functionally that there were more affluent, more politically connected white communities who said that we don't want certain things to be built like landfills, et cetera. And instead of them not being built or being built in areas that would not impact anybody, they were built and then subsequently put in the backyards of usually low wealth communities, right? And those things have certain outcomes, right? So when we look at the Homeowners Loan Corporation's redlining guide, it basically determines, based on all these different spatial factors and historic factors, where they saw communities as being most desirable or least desirable based through functionally the white gaze. And so they dictated where things would be built and where they wouldn't. And if you can see to this graph to the left, that this is the dark red areas are considered to be the worst areas versus the green areas that were considered to be the best. And of course, when you extrapolate this across our city, the same areas that we see economic suppression right now are functionally the same areas that were originally red lines and deemed to be undesirable back when we were going through this process of redlining, white flight, et cetera. And so I say all that to say, and then you look at to the right, this is the MasterCard inclusive growth score for the city of Atlanta. It's a tool that was developed by MasterCard, the corporation, to better use data to understand different insights into community. And so if you see, of course, across Atlanta, everything west and south of I-20 in particular, and if you go further east towards the 285 side, have very significant deep reds, which of course are also emblematic of negative economic growth, right, and opportunity that has functionally been a part of that. Of course, where we sit right now falls into these particular suppressed areas. And so again, you see this correlation against our city and history into the way that we see our communities develop design and how people have and created economic opportunities today. And I say all that to say that it really is, when we talk about this idea of making changes to our community, not just an idea about history as being yesterday's news, right? But these are things that are still occurring and still reinforced, right? That we understand that still, even right now, the spatial mismatch between housing and economic opportunity or job centers are things that continue to drive and reinforce this. So when you talk about with the In Her Hands pilot, right, and how you all looked at some of the urban, suburban, rural divide, right, that there was the same factors that saw this play out in Metro Atlanta that we were seeing across the state of Georgia, right, and that were suppressing the opportunity to build or to move upwardly or become upwardly mobile for the families that they were impacting as well. And so I say all that to say that when we're grounding this conversation, and you can go to the next slide for me, Alex, that this is just as much an idea around how do we have values that are really supportive of the type of economy that we want to see created in our communities moving forward, right? And that really are providing opportunity for everyone to have space. Here we have what's called the principles of economic inclusion. I mentioned our coalition building work, that we work with different organizations, individuals, elected leaders who are part of and come to this table with us, that we meet monthly, where we talk about what are the values that we like to see and that we would desire to see in our new economy, right? And so I'm not going to read all of these off for you, but some of these things are going to feature prominently, not only in this discussion today, but hopefully we'll ruminate with you a little bit as we move past this point. this idea about what is necessary for us to incorporate into the way we think about community today, and how do we start to design solutions, one that elevate these opportunities and these values, but then how do we think about differently where our programming can go, where our policy can go, and where we can collectively model these different things in the way we interact with community around us. Next slide, please. And so when we talk a little bit about, and I apologize that the slides look a little bunched up here, the Demanding Equitable Economic Development Project. This is a project that is under our Democratizing Development bucket of work, so to speak. And what we were really seeking to do through this process is understanding this relationship between not only spatial design, right, and the way communities are built and understood, but then what are the ways that public assets have been used as private goods, right? That there's something that we generally don't all the way deconstruct and think really specifically about, is this relationship between incentives and how they're being driven through the process of economic development. And I say it jokingly, but I'm always very honest about this. I've been doing economic development for almost a decade now, and my parents still don't really know what economic development is. It's a funny conversation to have, but it's really true in the idea that when we talk about development happening to people, it's like most people, when you ask them, you know, what do you want to see in your community, or how did their community become to be, they generally can't really answer. It's just like, well, I was here and then some stuff started getting built and then everything changed around me, right? And the reality is that currently in the state of Georgia, we are using and building our brand around being the -- state for business on the backs of different types of incentive deals that are ultimately disenfranchising, again, those same low income communities that we seek, that we say that we want to be impacting or helping, right? And robbing ourselves of opportunities to disrupt the cycle of poverty for different communities in different ways. And so what we did, particularly with this project, is we looked at Atlanta's tax allocation district structure. Those are, they might also be called TIFs, tax increment financing, and better understanding the way that property tax dollars themselves are used as a tool to subsidize the cost of private development for the purpose of increasing commercial activity in low income communities, right? And so through this process, we pulled a lot of data, naturally, about what these different deals looked like, helping people to understand, like, what is this longitudinal perspective on community and the impact. And then we kind of ask these two general questions, right? The first of that being is this tool even effective in doing what it's designed to do, right? That there's an idea around technical competency that we often don't ask and don't deconstruct enough about. We give a lot of deference to practitioners, and we believe that if we're going to use these things, that they're actually effective in doing what we think they're going to do. And oftentimes we don't stop to ask the question about, well, was it even effective, right? There's been a lot of talk at the Capitol this year around different audits of tax incentive deals, that there are a lot of promises made, this idea that, well, if we make these investments, it's going to generate a certain number of jobs and revenue and income. And we are seeing that when we really start to look at a little bit with a little bit more of a critical eye on this data, that those jobs aren't going to people in communities, that those wages are still being suppressed, that there isn't enough upward mobility being produced by these development deals. And so the second part of this question is, what's the opportunity cost, and is it constituting what we call the harm, right, in the process of executing these different incentive deals? And so we define the harm as being the opportunity cost of the investment against the promise of return on investment, one, but then two, looking at it from the perspective of a resident. Well, what do I believe to be a harm, right? This idea that I have and I live and occupy this space in my community, and that if I occupy this space in my community and then I'm subsequently displaced from or feel different development pressures as a result that might disrupt my opportunity to age in place, right, that those are considered harms, or other ways that we can see negative economic disparities be exacerbated through this process as well. And so what we found through this process, and I'll backtrack from what we found. What we did in our community engagement process, in addition to all the data and all the numbers, which kind of tell us very specifically, like, this is what was invested, this is what was foregone, right, then we have to better understand what the lived experiences of people are in the middle of this. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the TAB process, is functionally it requires, at least in the city of Atlanta, the opt-in of our three major anchor bodies: the city, Fulton County, and Atlanta Public Schools. And I'm not saying this, I don't know if anybody's here from either one of those institutions to call anybody out, but all three of them have to agree to invest themselves or to forego a portion of their property tax revenue, the way this process works, once they agree and someone, of course, petitions them to utilize TAD dollars, that there's then a floor that's established. And then as property taxes are invested in or have foregone for the purpose of commercial development, idealistically, what will happen is the value of that property and that place will then go up. And you see that reflected through your property tax values. Everybody here who is a homeowner has seen and gets that letter in the mail once or twice a year, depending on where you live or how fast your millage rate is changing, that says this is how much you're going to owe in property taxes, right? And that's functionally what this tool is designed to do. A lot of this was born out of the urban regeneration movements of the late 70s and 80s. This idea that's promoted through the Georgia Redevelopment Powers Law, that institutions and community have the right to remediate blight in slum areas through the incentivizing of commercial activity, right? And of course, through that law, we see some other things that we won't talk a lot about today, things like eminent domain and other that are born out of this same kind of idea. And so I really go back to this idea about value, because what we're really talking about is that there was a portion, right, or a value of people who looked at this opportunity and said, it's not just about increasing access to economic opportunity, but the conversation for them was really about slum clearing. It was this idea that we're not just trying to make this place better for the people who live here, but what we're functionally trying to do is displace them so we can move in better people. And I would encourage you, when you get a chance, to look up the Georgia Redevelopment Powers Law that has a lot of very specific and coded racialized language in it that talks about and characterizes the people who occupy these spaces that we call low wealth communities, right? And so understanding that the tool and the purpose of this tool is to increase the property tax value of these particular communities, functionally what we end up doing is creating this floor, and then everything above this floor then is supposed to be gone or foregone for the purpose of supporting commercial development as it is occurring, and then reinvesting in this place to make it more desirable, which then makes the property taxes go up and then makes it more valuable for the people who either occupy or own space there or that are looking to reinvest in these places at the same time. So what we have found through this process, right, is that currently through the process, the Atlanta Public Schools, and we have heard a lot about Atlanta Public Schools, particularly in their challenges with affordable housing, how that's impacting the student body, and even some of their educators and administrators as well, that they have already foregone over $500 million in property tax revenue over just the last few years, right? And so when you see that kind of tied together to this property tax structure, and you understand the purpose of property taxes themselves are a form of community reinvestment, that these are used for a purpose of financing community service, many of which are often used and tied to the way that we could disrupt poverty in communities. And so there are different trade-offs that are being made by institutions in our community right now that are then subsequently further disenfranchising communities of color. And something, of course, that plays itself into an ultimate concern of ours. And so
Sterling, just to jump in, just to do a time check.
Yes.
Maybe just one more minute so we can leave time for discussion.
Perfect. So again, so just like looking at the property tax value and the increases and how they place pressure on low wealth residents, whether that be directly as a homeowner or as a renter, of course, you see that translated through your monthly rent oftentimes. And then one of the most extensive harms or associated with the foregone revenue, which could be used to finance other types of services to disrupt this cycle of poverty in communities as well. So as a part of what we did in this process, in addition to the data and the numbers, of course, we sat down with community residents, we did focus groups, interviews, et cetera, and video interviews, and several of these will be released over the next couple of weeks. And so you'll be able to see them on YouTube, and we'll release them on our social media, where they're just people in community who are just talking about what they understand and really retaking this power of narrative, right? That they can tell their story in ways that just not only supplements the research, but helps them recapture and claim for themselves their own voice about what do they see and how they would like to see change enacted. And so I definitely want to give room for Q&A because I know people have been sitting patiently, but that's what the demanding equitable economic development projects look like. And of course, if you all find me afterwards, I will have some time to talk a little bit more about what that was.
Yes, thank you so much. Give Sterling an applause. Thank you. So, oh, this was a nice slide. I know we're rushing through. I do want to give one of our gracious partners at the Office of Planning and Research and Evaluation at Administration for Children and Families an opportunity to provide some remarks, and then we'll leave maybe just a brief moment for questions. But at this time, I'd like to invite Gabrielle Newell up to explore some of what she learned in this session with you all.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'll just share some brief remarks, but I know that we have a lot more that we continue to learn from these talented speakers, and I thank you for the reflections that you've shared already today. As Alex said, I'm Gabrielle Newell. I'm a senior social science research analyst in the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, which is the research office supporting the Administration for Children and Families within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The Administration for Children and Families, ACF, is what's sort of informally known as the human services side of Health and Human Services. So many different social service programs are administered within ACF, including temporary assistance for needy families. One of the themes I'm hoping that our talented speakers will expand on today is sort of this distinction between the public space and the private space. And we heard a lot about that just recently from Sterling. But within OPRE, we're thinking about within our lane, within our research office, what are the opportunities that we have to further advance racial equity? As we heard this morning from the Deputy Division Director within the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, racial equity is a priority for us. And so we're considering within our lane, what are the opportunities and also obligations we have to act on this? We're demonstrating our commitment to racial equity, such as funding this center and sort of investing federal and public dollars in this work. We're seeking to further equip ourselves in a shared understanding of what we can do within research and evaluation to further equity. And we're also really valuing and seeking how we can further invest in methods that uplift participant and voice. And so we heard some today about community-based participatory research, and I wonder if the team from In Her Hands would like to expand more on their approach to community-based participatory research. Just to open the conversation, and then I'll pass it over to perhaps our speakers to respond to any of these, and then to the audience to ask questions. But I'm curious to hear from the team with In Her Hands, the approach that you all took, as well as with the community partners you were working with, to set the benefit level for the guaranteed basic income. A question that I think many lobby at efforts to experiment with guaranteed basic income is, how do you know what is enough? And you walked us through sort of the different cohort model with different approaches to distributing the money. And then you also shared the 6-month findings showed that the percent of the sample that said they could not afford bills, it went down from 92.7% to 78.8%. But I would say that 78% is still a lot. People who would say that they don't have the money they need to afford their bills. So I'm curious how you might address the question of what is enough. But then to sort of take it to Sterling, and feel free to go anywhere with this, but I think the response to that question would actually be perhaps that we shouldn't be looking to one social service program to fully meet a family's needs. Instead, it's perhaps what Sterling called the sort of equity ecosystem. And then we might look to sort of development. And one thing I appreciated hearing from you, Sterling, is this complication of the public versus private divide. And I wonder if you might argue that that's a concept that's not really useful, this sort of artificial divide. And if anything, it feels like you're encouraging us to remember, those of us in the social services space, that we don't operate within a vacuum, but we also operate within, as you said, this equity ecosystem. And so how we can further coordinate in that way. So I'll close there, but just to reiterate some themes, I'm hoping you might expand on sort of this idea of public versus private. Is that a useful connection, or how instead can we might look at sort of this equity ecosystem? I wonder if you might expand more on your approach to community-based participatory research. And then finally, this question about benefit level for In Her Hands, this question of what is enough and how do you approach that question? Thank you all.
So we have, we have 4 minutes. So this is obviously a great reflections for future work, right? But if you could maybe touch a bit on how you landed, or expound a little bit more on how you got to the 850 or the bulk amount. And then on Sterling, if you could briefly touch on the actual practice of community-based research for the E program, E research. We can start with In Her Hands.
So the 850 amount was decided upon with community members. Again, that was to offset the expected loss in benefits that folks were typically participating in, public benefits like SNAP or TANF. And it was also based on prior research. So the Guaranteed Income Project out of Stockton, those recipients were receiving about $500 a month. And so taking feedback from that and then talking with community members, when we first presented the idea, we started at $500 and folks were just like, that's a non-starter, just because of the trade-off between the benefits that I'm receiving, it wouldn't be worth it. So starting at the 850 there, and then again with the lump sum, the input from community members on that. And I'm curious to, really get to the heart of what the impact of inflation is probably having on the funds not going as far as we had hoped. So glad to see that there are some shifts, but just curious, and have some assumptions about inflation impacting how impactful the funds can be. But that was just community input is how we landed on that amount.
I'll be brief. I mean, we hear the pain point first, right? And so the pain point for us was about the way that we see gentrification, displacement, et cetera, occurring in our communities today. And so we started to unpack a little bit more. What does that mean? What is the opportunity for us to really start to invest in shaping some sort of solution or unpacking kind of this process? And what was leading as we started kind of tugging at the string, so to speak, was this idea around the incentive cliff and how that interacts with the public sector and the private sector. And so again, just a lot of community conversation, interviews, focus groups. Like I said, the opportunity to reclaim their own narrative. And so like, I think that was probably the part of the process I enjoy most, is just sitting down with residents and saying like, one, tell us about the community that you remember and tell us about the community that you see. And then we could see kind of that through line between what they saw and remembered about the Atlanta that they were accustomed to. All of them had been lifelong Atlanta residents. And then we could then on the other side talk about the way that they were seeing things change as well. And so again, just kind of reinforcing, grounding. We also have some other work through our coalitions. We do one called Development Watch, which is working with a group of community members. And this is a part of that as well, about how do they understand and disrupt the development process, is being on the other side of that also.
Wonderful. Well, I have the world's worst job of having to close a super rich session, but I want to thank our panelists again for sharing their work. If you do have any questions, please find them in the audience. I'm hoping they'll stick around just for a few minutes to ask any questions. Well, nobody's tracking me down, telling me to get out of here. So yeah, so until they come in with a sign telling us to wrap, unless. And we'll keep the question brief
Okay.
in the responses.
So
as
my
well.
question is that how do we, as a underrepresented minority community, learn to overcome our own emotional and psychological barriers to collaborate with each other?
That's a loaded question. I'll take a first pass at this, and it's something that we talk a lot about. Is we overlook sometimes the harm that not only we as individuals have experienced through like living in our society, but the way that we interact with each other as organizations, right? And we talk about this ecosystem of partners, and we expect everybody to come together for the greater good. But a lot of times we've been forced to kind of conceive ourselves as competing for limited resources and been positioned to compete with each other in ways that forces us to alienate even from partners or people who should be partners of ours in this work too. And so I would say the first step to that is really just making space for healing, right? Like you have to, before we start talking about the work, how do we heal together? And it's not going to be overnight, right? It's a continual process. But we at least have to acknowledge that that's the first step, not only as organizations working with one another, but even as working with community, because of the mistrust and the damage and the harm that has been done sometimes, and not only the name of our economy, but even sometimes in the name of wanting to be helpful, right? And so how do we make sure we address that up front?
Yeah, take it.
I'd like to offer that also, what are the systemic things in place kind of forcing us into these positions where we're not able to work with each other? And so that makes me think of like, the crabs in a barrel adage. But if you think about it, crabs don't belong in a barrel. So when folks are put in situations where they aren't able to be their best selves or probably work towards their highest aims, it can lead to issues. So just curious to know, like, what can we do to remove that barrier that prevents that work from being done, so that we can create more good?
All right, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for attending this session. I believe next we have we have Dr. Rollins presenting another general session and closing panel. So that should be in this auditorium, so you can hang around here. But please follow up with our panelists if you have additional questions or suggestions or remarks. Obviously, it was too short, and I hope you have much more to share and looking forward to the future of your work. Thank you.